In this video, we're continuing to look at psychological explanations for schizophrenia. You've also watched the video looking at cognitive dysfunction, which included dysfunction to meta-representation and central control. And in this one, we're going to be looking at another type of psychological explanation, which is focused on family dysfunction. We're going to be looking at three particular types of dysfunctional family relationships, but you don't need to know all three. None of these are actually listed in the specification, and so I would recommend knowing two so that you're prepared for a one or more question on family dysfunction, but just use the ones that you know best. So when we're talking about family dysfunction as an explanation for schizophrenia, we're really focusing on maladaptive relationships in families. And we're also focusing on particular patterns of communication, which could be the cause of stress, which can therefore lead to the development of schizophrenia. So we're thinking way back to early childhood experiences and looking at how the family environment, how the communication patterns within families could cause schizophrenia. Now, something to note is that basically all of these explanations are now really outdated. We're going to tear this to shreds when we come to evaluating. But at the time, in the 1950s, before we had better understanding of biological explanations, these were really in vogue. These were the explanations that everybody believed to be true. Nowadays, it is the most hated, most taboo area of psychology, particularly the schizophrenogenic mother. But in the 50s, it was very popular, and there were more than 75 papers published on the schizophrenogenic mother in the 1950s. So nowadays, I urge you to be very critical, but do also know that this was very popular, and this was the dominant paradigm for explaining schizophrenia at the time. So we're going to be looking at several explanations. We'll be looking at schizophrenogenic mother, we'll be looking at double bind theory, and EE, expressed emotion. All of them are interesting, so I want to take you through all three, but you don't need to know all three for your exams. Just pick two to know in great detail. Okay, so let's focus on the first family dysfunction explanation. This is the schizophrenic mother. Do know how to spell this. Do know that this is not a mother with schizophrenia. We are not talking about a schizophrenic mother. No. We're talking about a schizophrenic mother. And this literally translates to schizophrenia causing. This is a mother that causes schizophrenia. It's a psychodynamic explanation, and this is basically saying that early childhood experiences shape adult personality. In this case, early childhood, living with this schizophrenic mother, then later leads to schizophrenia. It's based on patient childhood accounts, so it's retrospective, asking patients with schizophrenia to reflect back on their experiences of what their mother was like when they were growing up. And based on these interviews and case studies with schizophrenic patients, they seem to talk of this type of mother that was really common to lots of people who then developed schizophrenia. This mother is cold, rejecting, controlling, dominating, intrusive. And this mother creates an environment of great tension and secrecy. Because she's really dominating, because she's really cold and rejecting, the patient, before the onset of schizophrenia, develops a climate of distrust. The whole family is very suspicious of one another. And this climate of distrust can develop into paranoid delusions, the belief that someone is going to persecute you. And thus, this could lead then to schizophrenia. So, quite literally, this is a theory that says that people who grew up in a household where the mother is cold and rejecting and controlling will then not trust other people, and this distrust can lead to paranoid delusions and schizophrenia. I know we're not onto evaluation yet, but just something to note that, these patient childhood accounts were based on retrospective data with unreliable schizophrenic patients, and there was never a control group. I just need to make sure that before we go on, we're really making sure we understand exactly how this theory was developed. Okay, so that's our first example of family dysfunction. Our second example of family dysfunction is double bind theory, and this is Bateson's theory. So Bateson wasn't necessarily focused on a type of person in the family. He was more focused on the communication styles within families and thought that the way that people with schizophrenia talk to one another and about the person with schizophrenia could actually be a risk factor and could make the development of schizophrenia more likely. So double bind is basically contradictory situations that children are placed in by their parents. They receive mixed messages about what is right and what is wrong, and they're unable to seek clarification. There's basically a conflict between explicit and implicit communication. One negates the other. They contradict. In other words, it is control by confusion. Now, it's not the sole cause for schizophrenia, it's just one risk factor. So an example of this is receiving an explicit verbal message from the mother, for example, like "I love you," but the opposite implicit behavior is exhibited. So they're receiving explicit messages saying "I love you," but implicitly the mother stiffens when they're given a hug by the child, which is implicitly sending the message that the mother doesn't love the child. And this creates lots and lots of confusion. They're receiving contradictory environmental input. And this causes lots and lots of confusion. So they learn that the world is confusing and dangerous, then they withdraw socially. This can lead to disorganized thinking, which is just simply confused, and it can also lead to paranoid delusions, and therefore schizophrenia. So there's lots of other examples of double binds. They're really common, not just between parents and their children, but in any type of dysfunctional or abusive relationship. So, for example, even just hearing the phrase like "be spontaneous" is a double bind, because you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If after hearing that you then are spontaneous, then you're going to be accused of needing a prompt in order to enact that behavior, which is the opposite of spontaneity. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Likewise, a teacher could use double binds by asking you, "Have you finally started revising?" There's no right way to answer that. There is no right or wrong. If you say yes, then you're admitting that you're only finally starting. If you say no, then you're admitting that you haven't started. Either way, the message is clear. You're wrong. And this can create confusion because you're actually not sure about the right or the wrong way to respond. And they're quite tricky to spot. You know, you wouldn't in that moment be able to say, "Oh, this is a double bind. I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't" here. They're really, really tricky to spot. And so it's really hard for you to ask and seek clarification about what answer they're sort of expecting from you. And so the child or the person in the abusive relationship really fears getting it wrong, because quite often if they get the answer wrong or they respond in an inappropriate way, they're going to be punished by the withdrawal of love. And so again, this is another, I guess in this case, psychodynamic explanation. But there's lots and lots of examples of double binds in different types of relationships. Not necessarily it causing and leading to schizophrenia, but it does exist, and this has been well reported. Another example could be sort of that classic stereotypical girlfriend-boyfriend relationship. The boyfriend asks, "Is it okay if I go out with my friends?" And the girlfriend says, "Yeah, sure, only if you want to." Okay, so how is the man in that situation supposed to respond? There's lots of other examples. Maybe that wasn't the best one, but actually, the best way to phrase that one, I think, would be the opposite. Would be the boyfriend wanting to go out with friends, but saying, "Oh, do you want me to stay in instead and cook dinner?" And then the girlfriend says, "Oh, only if you want to." how is he to behave then? What is he to do? Because if he then does go out with his friends, he's saying that he doesn't want to spend any time with his girlfriend. But if he does stay home, then that's also not the right thing to do. So you're kind of damned if you do, you're damned if you don't in that case. And that's kind of a sign of more or less an abusive relationship. But the idea here from Bateson's theory is that this communication style leaves the child thinking that the world is really confusing, can lead to disorganized behavior and paranoid delusions, and then can lead to schizophrenia. So here's an example. There was a quote from a psychiatrist's case notes. So what a horrible situation. So what she's saying there isn't reflecting the implicit messages that she's sending. And then the fact that he's blushing, there's then criticism there. He's not allowed to actually show his feelings. And so he really can't win in this situation. And it's creating control by confusion. First of all, how do you articulate what's happening and how do you know that it's wrong? In this scenario, the mother left and then the patient actually assaulted an aide and had to be restrained. And so what we see here is real mixed messages and the patient being unable to respond to the inconsistency. And that confusion can then lead to the symptoms of schizophrenia. The final type of family dysfunction is expressed emotion, or EE. And we're talking about EE, we're talking about the level of emotion, we're particularly talking about negative emotion that is expressed by the family members of somebody with schizophrenia, either towards a sufferer or about them. And there's a few key elements of expressed emotion. The first is verbal criticism. So you're so lazy, you just need to pick yourself up and get back to work. So verbal criticism of the patient. There's quite often hostility and anger and rejection, and this can also include physical abuse. And there's also emotional over-involvement. So there's a bit of helicoptering here. Because typically families want the best for their children. Mothers and fathers want the best for their children. And so they can become overly involved in the patient. They want what's best for them, and so they're going to make sure they're always taking their medication. They're going to be driving them to all of their appointments. They're going to be constantly asking them, are you okay? Are you experiencing a delusion? Are you experiencing an hallucination right now? And this can actually create a lot of stress for the person with schizophrenia. And this theory, it can explain the trigger for the disorder, but it's actually been most applied to explaining relapse. So explaining how somebody, after coming out of hospital and returning to the family, then sees the reappearance of their symptoms. And so the disorder returns after a period of being better. So expressed emotion is verbal criticism, hostility and rejection, and emotional over-involvement. I'd suggest coming up with some sort of acronym or acrostic or some sort of mnemonic to remember the three aspects of expressed emotion. So as I said, EE has been a really effective explanation for the high relapse rates of people with schizophrenia. So in this graph, we can see two time periods, at 9 months and 2 years. And in the green, we're dealing with families that show high expressed emotion. So they show those characteristics of verbal criticism, hostility, and emotional over-involvement. And here we've got low expressed emotion families. And the way that these are assessed is basically through an interview with the family members while with the patient, or the family members alone. And they get them to talk about the disorder, talk about the patient. And they can measure on scales the level of verbal criticism, the level of hostility, and they can assess the way they're talking about schizophrenia and the schizophrenic patient. And they can give them a rating to determine whether they're high or low EE. So when we compare the percentage of patients who relapse, whose symptoms return following hospitalization, we can see that expressed emotion is a reliable predictor of relapse. Patients who return to a high EE family are much more likely to relapse at both 9 months and 2 years than patients who are returning to low EE families. I know it doesn't match up with this data, but if you wanted to report this, there are some statistics. So the relapse rate for high EE is 48% versus low EE, 21%. So all in all, expressed emotion increases the risk of relapse in recovering schizophrenics.